just bought a new.
Like many of you, I started out on mirrorless cameras with the Lumix G7, and in that tier of cameras, you don't really have to mess around with bit rates. However, if you step up to cameras like the G9, the GH5, the GH5s, all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of other options and it can get confusing really quickly. So today we're going to focus on bit rates. Do they really matter? The weird thing is that there's so many videos about 8-bit versus 10-bit, but something sorely missing from YouTube is videos about bit rates. That's the amount of megabits per second your camera is recording. So I'm not an expert in this field, but I'll link as many sources as I can down below. Those sources helped me make this video. This video took me a long time to test and to produce, and this video is probably going to be long as well. But the short answer to the question, do bit rates matter, is yes, more than you think, but the answer isn't so simple. So on to some notes. Firstly, these tests are not the be-all end-all test. The only reason I want to do it is just to see if there's going to be a visible difference for me and in my workflow for what I do on YouTube. Also, I don't color grade, I mostly do exposure adjustments, and I prioritize a faster workflow. Also, I don't own a G7 anymore, but I do have the GX9, which uses the same bit rates, and the GX9 has the 20 megapixel sensor, and you also get that on the G95, but the G7 and the G85 are using the older 16 megapixels. So testing isn't perfect, but it should provide you a frame of reference, which is better than guessing. And lastly, these tests took me several days to finish, so not all the shots match exactly, but it should give us a ballpark figure anyway. Also, before we start, what is a megabit per second? Let's break it down. A megabit is written with a small b rather than a big B you get in megabytes. Megabytes, which you're probably more familiar with, is written with a capital B, and is how we measure a lot of the file sizes we use every day, from picture sizes, from audio files, from smaller videos like this one. A megabit is just a smaller megabyte. To be precise, it's 8 times smaller, which is weird because when you step up from a megabyte to a gigabyte, that's 1,000 times, not 800 times. So it's a messy system. If you're recording on the G7 in 1080p, chances are you're going to be recording at around 3 megabytes per second, depending on what frame rate you're using. So as I already mentioned, it took me days to finish this, so I had to impose some limits to the testing. For all the footage, I applied several levels of exposure adjustments, which is what I normally do for my YouTube videos. This is just basic stuff like playing with curves and overall exposure and saturation. Also, I only tested in 24p because that's what I typically use for YouTube and talking heads, and I feel like it's much harder to get exposure correct on a human face. I also tested 400 megabits per second on the GH5, but it turns out my SD cards aren't fast enough to record in that setting. However, it did let me record 20-second clips, and it doesn't look like it affected the image in any way, so we're just gonna go with it. I also did some low and high ISO tests, and in this regard I used 200 ISO and 3200 ISO just because I actually have to use those high ISOs or even higher for some of my jobs, and it's just nice to know whether bit rates affect your high ISO performance. I'm almost done, I swear. On the two cameras, I used the natural profile and I turned down sharpening to its lowest setting, that's -5, for both the GH5 and the GX9, just to try and match it up. I know that the colors aren't exactly the same on those two cameras, but that's imperfect testing. One more thing to note is that the GX9 crops a lot in 4K, even more than the G7 and the G85. So if you're using this video to compare between those two cameras, just keep that in mind. So last but not least, I used the Sigma 18 to 35, going from ISO 200 to ISO 3200 by going from f1.2 to f5.6. Now you're gonna see some differences in vignetting and differences in depth of field, but for these tests, that doesn't matter. Okay, let's get to the results. On to some general impressions. Firstly, 4K is sharper than 1080p. I know this may be obvious to a lot of you, but let's just get that out of the way first. Also, the 1080p and 4K are consistently sharper on the GH5 than on the GX9. Not something I was expecting, but I think this is where we're starting to see those bit rates making a difference. Something I saw again and again is that in general, it seems like the higher the bit rate, the better the image quality. But don't think this is the rule, because Olympus cameras have higher bit rates than 1080p, but their video just isn't as sharp. Looking more closely at the GX9, its footage just wasn't as sharp or as vibrant as the GH5, and because I was comparing it side by side, it was obvious to me which was which. Straight out of camera and also after my exposure adjustments, the highlight roll-off was just softer, the color was richer on the GH5, even though in general I think the GX9 has better color in stills, it isn't the same story in video. However, if I didn't see it side by side, I don't think I'd be able to notice. If you're using it in the same video consecutively, I also think it'd be harder to spot. In terms of the GX9 high ISO test in general, it seems like the higher the bitrate, the lower the noise, the better the color. But that's the short answer. But before we get to the long answer, something I didn't expect is that there isn't a clear answer for the GX9 as to which is better for shooting in low light, 1080p or 4K. You can pretty much expect a proportional amount of noise in relation to sensor sizes. So for example, on Micro Four Thirds, you can expect around 2 times more noise compared to full frame at any given ISO. Of course, you can't actually compare this with different generations of cameras because every generation of camera actually improves on this aspect. However, in my test, it seems like the answer is more complicated than that. If you care more about noise, shoot in 1080p. There's marginally less noise than in 4K, but the other half of the equation, and the one I hardly see discussed on YouTube, is color shift. That's one of the other things that happens when you crank up that ISO. The colors start to change. Now, if you care more about getting richer or more accurate colors in high ISO situations, shoot in 4K. There's a difference there, and in my opinion, this is a better trade-off because people can forgive noise, but people tend to be more sensitive to color. Moving on to impressions about the GH5, the image quality got progressively better the higher up the bitrate ladder you went, but once you reached that 400 megabits per second, it almost seemed like it was coming from a different camera. Now, I know online it seems like nobody thinks that it's worth it to shoot in 400 megabits per second. They say that it's the same as 150 megabits per second, but for me, on my computer, I can see it. There's a difference. The test videos are obviously from different takes. Like I said, it took a long time to complete these tests, but have a look on the right side of my face where that rim light is hitting. Even though the 150 megabits looks better overall because of slightly different lighting, and because this wasn't after 3 hours of testing, overall, look at how the skin is just sharper at 400 megabits per second. When my jaw moves up and down, the skin remains sharp. Whereas on the 150 megabits per second, it looks like it's getting soft when there's movement. The image reminds me of high budget documentaries, and I've always wondered about this because I know that those documentaries use higher end cameras like the C500 and even Reds, but I always wondered what exactly about those images made the picture look more lifelike. And no matter what I did to the G7, the G85, shooting in 4K, shooting with better lights, I just could never get that look. And I always wondered about that, but now I think we're starting to see some of the elements of that, and I think the amount of data per frame has something to do with it. Moving on to the ISO test, there's not as much difference in the low ISO footage all the way from 1080p to 4K until you reach 400 megabits per second. This is just special. I don't know. I can definitely see the difference. I don't know if you can see it through YouTube compression, and I don't know what everybody else on the internet is on about, but I can definitely see a visible difference. In high ISO situations, the color shift is better controlled in 4K. In general, the color shift and noise are more progressive on the GH5. It gets slightly better and better the higher the bitrate you use. However, once you reach 400 megabits per second, I feel like it's definitely better than the rest. Something a little controversial in my findings, to my eye, the all-eye at 400 megabits per second at 3200 ISO was just slightly worse than the GX9 shooting 4K at 200 ISO. The colors on the GH5 are slightly worse, and there's slightly more noise, but overall I am shocked at how comparable they are. But remember, we're talking about technical details here. In the final product, are you likely to notice this? Probably not. Did I notice a difference between the compressions of long GOP and all-eye? For the most part, not so much until, you guessed it, using 400 megabits per second. Side note, I know this video is all about bit rates, but we can't isolate all of the variables, so one of those variables is compression. The short version is that long GOP takes the first frame and then compares subsequent frames to it. So for example, on this set, it will take the first image, and that will be a complete frame, but then the subsequent frames, it'll only look for data where there was movement. So all of this, my hands and my face, it's recording data on that, but it's trying to avoid recording data on everything else that hasn't moved in an effort to save space. All-eye, on the other hand, treats every frame as its own frame. So this is more like shooting burst mode in stills. It treats every frame as its own picture, so just keep that in mind. Overall, these cameras have excellent video quality regardless of whether it's in 1080p or 4K. In fact, if you compare the 1080p on the G7, or in my case the GX9, to other cameras in its class, you might be interested to find that the 1080p looks really good compared to other manufacturers, where they will opt for good 4K, but their 1080p will be really muddy, and that's a big no-no in my book. Something else I noticed is that there's a visible difference between 1080p and 4K, and so especially if you're using those mid-tier cameras, if you want the best image quality possible, shoot in 4K. The GH5 on the other hand still seems like it's one of the best video cameras in the game, whether it's 1080p or 4K, which is really strange because it's been out for 3 years. Having said that, if you compare the GX9 to a GH5, the image quality isn't exactly the same. The bit rates do matter. Higher is actually better, but whether it matters to you is entirely up to you. If you're matching footage between a GH5 and a mid-tier Lumix camera, and you need to match those shots as close as possible, I'm talking like your client or you are super strict about matching shots, which in my opinion only really matters for very specific types of filmmaking, then shoot in 4K. 4K on the mid-tier cameras is comparable and passable as footage on the GH5. If, however, you don't care, or your clients don't care, or you're like me and you prioritize a faster workflow, shoot in 1080p and save the space. Looking at the best 1080p options for YouTube on the GX9, obviously you only have one choice, but it's fine. I used it for years, I still use it to this day, it's solid. For the GH5, I felt like the best middle ground was that 100 megabits per second in 10-bit. It isn't as large as the all-eye 200 megabits per second in 1080p, but the image quality isn't that much different to my eyes. Overall, it gives you nice colors and low light performance isn't so bad. For bigger productions for not YouTube and in 1080p, I'd probably use this codec. Looking at the best 4K options for YouTube on the GX9, obviously you only really have that one choice, but it's fine. It's still a solid codec, and while it's not class leading anymore, it's still up there with other cameras in its class. For the GH5, the best overall 4K for me was 8-bit 100 megabits per second, and the reason for this is it's for YouTube, and I found that my exposure corrections didn't make much of a difference with higher bit rates. If you're producing for outside of YouTube and you want as much data, then feel free to use 150 megabits per second and 400 megabits per second and 10-bit color. For me, I'll probably use that 150 megabits per second for interviews and big projects, and if the budget is high enough, I'll even consider using the 400 megabits per second just to get that high-end dock look. For my workflow on YouTube, I think I'm going to stick to 1080p, 100 megabits per second at 10-bit, because there's no storage tax between 10-bit and 8-bit, so why not? And you may be thinking, why 1080p over 4K? In general, I like 1080p better for people and 4K for objects. You don't need that level of sharpness for a person's face. In fact, most people, myself included, prefer not to have it so sharp. The only time I use 4K in my interviews is when I have a decent distance from the subject so it's not so sharp on their face, but then I have the luxury of cropping in later. At the end of the day, these are just tests for myself, and I just hope to help anybody else that's asking the same questions as me. And overall, you do see a bump in image quality when you upgrade to a pro level camera in the Lumix line, but it's always nice to know exactly what you're gonna get. And lastly, do bit rates matter? Yes, probably more than you think, but the answer isn't so simple.
I just bought a new whip, spend a couple thousand just to cruise it. Shawty said she love me, but I swear she never prove it. I never tell her, but I put it in the music. Well, that's okay.